Chapter 2, A Multiplication of Goblins. Goblins are not particularly pleasant creatures. They are not friendly, nor are they particularly family-oriented. They go out of their way to find pleasure in the misfortune of others, and other than food, this is the one thing that usually would keep them going. What they did do well, though, was to live in clans and multiply. They multiplied like rabbits, until their food source could no longer sustain the clan, and they had to downsize, which in general mean that the lowest-level creatures in the clan either became the food source or they were otherwise exiled. To these low-level members, the result was usually the same as it was out in the wild. A single goblin or even a small group of low-level monsters was as good as dead. They were not hardy beings, especially at the lower levels, and until they took a skill, they were practically useless to everyone and everything around them. They were short, weak, and did not fight with any skill. They simply relied upon numbers to overwhelm their usually much stronger enemies. Ushuk was a level 1 goblin adolescent, and that meant that he was at the very bottom of the pile when it came to life in the Cracknook clan. Well, as bottom as it can get without being an actual goblin baby, of which there were many in most of the goblin clans that usually sprung up in the forests. Cracknook had been the name that the goblin chieftain had bestowed upon the clan once he realized that he could get a fair amount of enjoyment out of literally cracking his own knuckles, or by using that act as punishment against others when he felt that they deserved it. Garrick was the name of the chief, and by all accounts he was a tough individual. Muscular, and at least a foot taller than every other goblin in the clan, Garrick had taken 3 mates, who he kept nearby most of the time, so if he ever fancied a fondle, at least one of them would be within reach. The Cracknook clan was booming by the standards of the early days of freedom. With over 100 goblins ranging from babies through adolescents, hunters, warriors, mages, and up to the chief himself, they were self-sufficient, and still growing sure to be a force to be reckoned with if they were ever to grow their ambitions. They wouldn't know it, but they were actually the largest clan within freedom during the peak of their growth. Sadly for the clan, other than multiplying and eating and playing jokes on each other, their plans for world domination sat firmly on the back burner. "Ah!" Ushuk announced loudly as he bit into what he thought was going to be the most delicious apple that he'd ever seen. It was so shiny and looked so ripe just laying there at his feet that he simply couldn't resist. Ushuk and his best goblin friend Tog had gone into the woods immediately surrounding their clan's campsite to see if there were any delicious treats to gather. Both of the adolescents being so far down the totem pole, all they ever seemed to get to eat were cast-offs, or the otherwise slightly rotting leftovers that the rest of the clan didn't fancy eating. The apple that Ushuk had bitten into was hollow, and to his horror, absolutely full to the brim of wriggling maggots. He spat out the offending insects onto the ground and began to wipe his tongue free of the disgusting texture and taste. When he looked up from his never-ending task, he could see Tog with his back against the ground, holding his belly and laughing so much he could barely control himself. After a minute or so, he managed to catch his breath, though he didn't see Ushuk bearing down upon him to enact his revenge. Ushuk kicked Tog as hard as he could in the ribs. Both goblins, being level 1, it did little damage in terms of the health bar that they both could see, though it did wind Tog, and his laughing quickly morphed into pained coughing. "Tog, get Ushuk. Good." Tog managed to wheeze out as he gingerly brought himself up to his full 2.5 feet height. Ushuk pushed Tog by his shoulders, though it was less of an attack and more of a frustrated retaliation. "Don't worry, Tog." Ushuk smiled with a toothy grin. "Ushuk know where Tog sleep. Ushuk get payback." Tog looked a little worried at the statement, though this sort of horseplay was how most goblins enjoyed their free time. From gentle ribbing to outright bullying, it was the way that goblins kept boredom at bay. It was, of course, all fun and games, until you messed with the wrong goblin. The pair then continued on through the woods without any other incidents that would cause fighting to break out between them. It did not mean, though, that whenever there was a particularly prickly or nettly bush along the edges of the trail they blazed, one or the other wouldn't push or nudge the other into it, and burst out laughing as they watched them remove thorns or needles from their arms, hands, or the most hilarious of places, their backside. Eventually, the pair realized that the sun had moved along the sky so that the shadows had grown longer, and dusk was upon them. They knew that now they must return home to their clan and camp before it was too late. In the settling darkness, though, Ushuk saw something on the ground that made him stop for a moment. Tog carried on, apparently unaware of Ushuk's moment of pause, and before his friend could even turn to see what he had found, Ushuk squirreled what he had found away in his underpants, the term squirreled here being used as both an action and, in the literal sense, as what Ushuk had found was indeed a dead squirrel. He knew that this opened a new and welcome door for his revenge on Tog, and he wasn't going to let it pass him by. The pair eventually returned to the clan and made their move to get to their beds. All the goblins, except for the chief and his mates, slept together in one log mud and leaf-covered den, although each did have a tiny space to call their own. Ushuk made his way to his bed, or ragged furs littered on the ground to be more accurate, and awaited the ever-present drone of loud goblin snoring that filled the room each and every night. After a long while had passed, and Ushuk could be certain that every other goblin in the den was fast asleep, he rose to his feet and began to tiptoe as quietly and as stealthily as he possibly could. To anyone who was watching, the movements that the goblin adolescent were making would have seemed overanimated, overacted, and entirely unnecessary because, as Ushuk took his careful steps within the den, his feet came comically high to where his hips were with each step. Ushuk stopped suddenly. He felt something squish under his bare foot, and cringing as he looked down to see what he was standing on. Beneath his person, he saw the sleeping face of one of the goblin adults of the clan. Ushuk had managed to stand upon his hand. All was not lost, though. His action had not woken the sleeping goblin, and as carefully as he could, Ushuk stepped onward, releasing the pressure from atop the appendage. The adult snored a little louder and moved his hand slightly, but thankfully he did not stir. This was one of the times it was good to be small, weak, and light. Ushuk finally made it to where he could see the outline of Tog sleeping upon the floor. He could tell that his friend was sleeping because Tog liked to sleep on his front, with his hands and feet splayed out behind and in front of him like a dog. Ushuk reached down into his underpants and retrieved the dead squirrel that he had picked up earlier. The creature was warm, not because it was alive, rather because it had been somewhat fermenting in Ushuk's briefs. Ushuk regarded it for just a moment, then placed it neatly onto the ground next to Tog. Then he placed one of the tiny squirrel hands upon Tog's face, stifled a laugh, and made his way back to his own bed. The next morning, the entire clan was awoken by a blood-curdling scream. "Scry, srib, scribble, scrab, monster!" As he happily opened his eyes, Ushuk could hear the screams coming from Tog. Then, as though things couldn't get any better, Tog launched the deceased rodent high into the den, where it rose up, then fell and disappeared into the sea of sleeping bodies. Then all broke loose. The first scream seemed to bring along with it a wave of bodies leaping to their feet as they tried to escape from whatever it was that had brushed against them. Then everyone was on their feet and screaming and shouting at each other. Inevitably, punches were thrown, and things were getting decidedly out of hand. The den was in uproar. Ushuk, who still lay on his bed, couldn't stop himself from laughing. He laughed until his cheeks and stomach hurt, though that did nothing to stop him. He held his belly and laughed, getting louder and louder as he did so. That was until he realized that nobody else was laughing. In fact, nobody else was making any noise at all. They were just looking at him, and they seemed mad. "What going on here?" The booming voice that belonged to the clan chief brought Ushuk back to his senses. "I visit too many noise!" he roared. Ushuk looked up to see that many of the goblins in the room were still looking directly at him. Some were even pointing. "This one," one of the goblins exclaimed, and it made the chief turn his attention right toward Ushuk's. He knew that this was bad and couldn't scramble quickly enough to get his makeshift sandals onto his feet. What he wasn't expecting, though, was to feel something cold and squelchy beneath his foot. "Ah!" Ushuk yelled as he looked down towards the floor and saw that within his sandal had been a perfectly concealed dump. Tog must have had a similar idea to his own last night, and had left a little present in there for Ushuk to find in the morning. Ushuk could see the offending article squeezing its way between his little toes, but before he could do anything about it, he was lifted off the ground by the chief by the scruff of his neck. Ushuk rotated slowly in the air for a moment before coming face to face with the person who he was scared of the most in the entire world. "Shh," the chief said loudly as he placed a single finger to his lips. "No more noise." Ushuk did his best to nod in agreement, though what he managed was a little mid-air bob up and down instead. His meaning was understood, though. Upon seeing that Ushuk had fallen for his own prank, Tog danced from foot to foot, whilst pointing at Ushuk's stinking foot. It was surely a mistake for him to do so, though, because within a moment the chief had picked him up similarly to Ushuk and carried them both outside. "You take this outside," the chief stated in a more sociable volume, now that he was indeed outside. "Fight it out." Ushuk looked at Tog, who suddenly had a very worried look on his face. For the pair to gain the attention of the chief in such a negative way, and then be told to fight it out, this was every little goblin's worst nightmare. The chief dropped the pair to the ground, and within a few moments they had been surrounded by the rest of the clan as though ready to fight out in a school playground. Ushuk and Tog had fought before, but it was never with an audience, and where Ushuk still had one squishy sandal on, Tog was still barefooted. "Fight now!" the chief exclaimed loudly for all to hear. "Winner get more food," he then announced thoughtfully. Ushuk and Tog both felt their stomachs rumble at that particular proclamation, and without hesitation, Tog swung a fist directly at Ushuk's face. Ushuk ducked the strike and dove at Tog, grabbing his friend around the waist, and both of them fell to the ground in a puff of dust. Ushuk hit Tog's chest with balled fists a few times, but Tog eventually managed to throw him off. The pair again returned to their feet. Then Tog kicked up at Ushuk wildly over and over as though he was trying to break his ribs, though Ushuk managed to block the blows. When the fifth strike came, Ushuk caught Tog's leg and pushed him over and onto the ground once again. Then Ushuk had a funny thought. He kicked off the sandal that had housed Tog's present to him and brought his foot up onto Tog's face while he was on the ground, scrambling to get back up. When Tog realized what was happening, and as the smell hit his nostrils, he let out a loud "ee." Ushuk couldn't help but laugh. It was simply too funny to get one over on Tog like this. Sure, fighting was good for resolving disputes and all, but pulling off a prank like this just meant so much more. Fighting was what enemies did, and these two were not enemies. They were friends, and friends pulled pranks. Tog then wiped his face and threw a piece of the turd towards Ushuk, which hit him in the chest with a loud splat. Ushuk looked down with his mouth open wide, and for a second he felt angry, though before that emotion could show, he laughed. Then Tog laughed. Then the chief laughed, and with that, every goblin that was watching laughed at the display these two little ones had put on for them. "Food for both," the chief announced loudly for all to hear. "After wash," he announced thoughtfully. Washing was not something that many of the goblins of the clan did with any regularity, so to be told to wash by the chief was kind of an odd thing. Generally, it meant that whoever was on the receiving end of the instruction was particularly disgusting. Ushuk and Tog could not complain. They both went down to the river that ran alongside their campsite and washed as much of themselves as they could before retuning and smelling far less like, though just a little wetter than before. "There, that not better?" the chief asked as the pair returned and their attention eagerly returned to the promise of extra food. Both of the small goblins nodded obediently. Then, just as they had been speaking, there was a loud whistle that seemed to come from all around them, and the goblin chief suddenly had a new faraway look in his eyes. Ushuk could see what had happened, though. There was now the tip of an arrow protruding from the chief's chest. And then there was another and another. The chief stumbled 2 steps forward, then fell to the ground with a loud oomph. "Attack! Attack!" Ushuk screamed as he ran from the chief's fallen body, with his arms flailing in the air. He was no fighter, although shouting the alarm so that the clan's real defenders could do their work was not an insignificant thing. Ushuk ran with Tog following just behind him until he reached a small den and darted inside. They both knew that it would afford little protection to either of them if the worst came to the worst, but they knew what to do in these situations. The warriors did their bit, and everyone else kept out of the way. Thankfully for Ushuk, the den that they had chosen to hide in had some pinpricks of light filtering through, which meant that they could watch what was happening outside. Ushuk couldn't yet see the attackers or even where they had come from, though he could see the occasional arrow flying through the air and into his campsite, and the frantic scurrying of greenish blurs as his kin moved into position to ward of their attackers. Then he saw them. Through the ranks of goblins forming up and clutching their knives, axes and spears were approaching figures in shining silver armor, riding brilliant white horses. Some of them held bows and arrows and others swords, but whatever they had, it looked as though it was masterfully crafted. The goblins didn't stand a chance against whatever this organized and well-equipped force was. Ushuk had to look away after the first enemy soldier reached the front goblin lines. It barreled into his kin and took down at least 7 or 8 as its charge was unimpeded. Then there were more, so many more. "Tog, we need go." "Now," Ushuk stated forcefully, though keeping his voice low as he turned to move from the den. Tog looked as though he was frozen in fear. "Tog, now," Ushuk reiterated. Though when he looked at his friend, all he could see were the tears in his eyes and the frozen stature of a being that was petrified by both fear and sadness. Ushuk looked at the exit from the den and the thick woods in the distance, and he knew that he would be able to escape from their attackers there. But he could not leave his friend behind. He would never leave a friend like that. "No worry, Tog. Ushuk stay," Ushuk stated, and he curled his arms around Tog's shoulders. The pair then sat and waited for whatever would befall them. The attack was unrelenting, and the goblin clan was sorely under-equipped and overwhelmed by their enemy in a matter of minutes. The clan had been wiped out, with all of the goblins' defenders having been killed where they stood without much reply. Then the attackers began to set alight to the tiny buildings of the settlement, and as they had been constructed of dirt, leaves, sticks, and wood, they burned quickly and ignited without issue. Before long, there was just one small den left standing, and inside sat Ushuk and Tog, awaiting their final moment within freedom. There's two of them in this one. A male voice sounded from outside their den, and Ushuk knew that now was the moment for him to either simply lay down and accept death or fight for his life. When he looked at Tog, though, he knew that his friend would still not make any move to aid himself. Ushuk still refused to leave. "Set it ablaze with the rest of them," a second male voice replied. Then, after a moment of not much happening except the goblins, both gritting their teeth, a face appeared at the entrance to the den. It was a young male face of no more than 20, with long blonde hair and sharp pointed features. Ushuk knew that this was an elf, and he could see that it was level 10. "But, you're just children," the elf said quietly as his gaze fell upon Ushuk and Tog. "Surely you're of no threat to me, are you?" he asked. Tog didn't look up, though. Ushuk stared at the elf without making a sound. "You're petrified, aren't you?" the elf continued. His voice sounded soft and caring to Ushuk's ears, but every part of his being told him not to trust this creature. "Listen, I'm going to start the fire at the back. You just run, okay? Run into the woods and don't look back," the elf said, and then abruptly disappeared, although Ushuk could hear him moving around the den and away from his exit. Ushuk then slapped Tog in the face hard. "Tog, we go now," Ushuk instructed, and the act seemed to have done the trick as Tog wiped his face and rose to his feet. Then he looked at the exit, and without even a single look back at Ushuk, the goblin bolted for the woods. Ushuk himself was only second behind, but his heart thumped as his feet pounded the earth beneath him. He didn't stop either, but once the pair was safe within the tree line, they halted to see if there were any goblins left to follow them. What they saw, though, was the entire campsite ablaze with orange flames spewing black smoke high into the air. Ushuk's friends, family, and home had just been lost in a single moment. "What we do?" Tog asked, still panting. "We go, make new life," Ushuk said flatly, and turning his back to the Cracknock clan, he began to walk.